And you could take a seat. Oopsie. Lee is here. Oh, you don't have to be absolutely silent. We can always edit. So I was just letting everybody know so that, you know, it's an ethical practice so that you know you're on camera. It's always Ellie's calling. Okay. Hello, Lee.
Hello.
Can you see us?
Hi. Can you? Yeah, I can see you. Can you see me?
No. We see a sort of bot-like thing. Do you want to hang up and I can try calling you?
Okay, you can try that. Let's do that.
Yeah, let's see if that works. Hello?
Let's see.
There you are. Now we can see you. Hi, Lee. So I hope you can see us. So it's kind of panned out. So I'll just make a basic introduction, talk about what's going on, and then you have the floor. So I am Tripti Pillai. My collaborator, Jen Boyle, had to run to a meeting, The Glamorous Life of Academia. So she will be back in about 45 minutes, but she is the director of the Digital Commons and Design program, which is part of the initiative that is holding this one-day symposium. The venue is the Digital Commons. It's an intimate kind of space, so you'll see people walking in and walking out. It's not in any overt disrespectful gesture. It's just people walking in and walking out as they will. And Jen's initiative is collaborating with mine, which is the Arts and Humanities Global Experience Program. And we put together this one-day symposium called the Digital Global, which is, of course, cryptic and designed to be weird and cryptic so that we can think about the weirdness and the cryptic nature of what it means to be digital citizens, or what it means to inhabit a digital environment, just as what it means to be global. So the basic practice is we have about an hour, and maybe if you can talk for 30 to 40 minutes and leave some time for Q&A, and we'll wrap up just before the hour so that we can queue in for the next speaker. That would be wonderful. And if you want me to like wave at you and say 15 minutes, or if you're keeping time, that's wonderful. Whatever you want, just let me know. I have an introduction of who you are so that our colleagues here have a better sense of what delights they can prepare for. This is Lee Mackinnon. Lee Mackinnon is a senior lecturer in photographic theory and history at University of the Arts, London. Lee's writing has been included in edited collections by eFlux, such as What's Love Got to Do with It, which was published in 2017, and Amour and Pitouk, where her work titled Algorithmic Life, Calculative Devices in the Age of Big Data was published by Routledge. As well as writing for Third Text, recent articles have featured in Leonardo, which was published by MIT Press, and eFlux Journal in 2016. She has recently co-edited a special edition of the Journal of Aesthetics and Culture entitled The Techniques and Ethics of Love, which is forthcoming in May this year from Taylor and Francis. She has exhibited works, including in exhibitions in the Bloomberg space in London, and I am going to mispronounce this, so correct me and forgive me. Noordeland's
That's pretty good.
Noordeland's Kunstmuseum.
I can't really pronounce it myself. I mean, it's, yeah.
I should not be laughing. Bad. Noordeland's Kunstmuseum in Denmark. Lee's talk for us this afternoon. It's evening for Lee, so many thanks for doing this out of the bounds of the work time. But Lee's talk for us today is titled "Data Bodies and Living Currency." So you're up, Lee. Thank you.
No, thank you. It's really nice to see you. It seems to be quite warm there, judging by how you're dressed. Here is really freezing.
I know. I'm sorry. It's not terrible here, but...
So I've been putting some ideas together that are quite new, actually. So I'm kind of looking forward to getting some feedback, if you feel like feeding back or asking questions, because it's quite contentious material, I think. And I'm sure some of you will want to pick me up on certain points. So I hope you feel able to do that. I would really welcome it. So thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me and attending. It's really a great pleasure. So I'm going to talk about data bodies, and particularly the kind of trade in young women, which happens in various ways and on various platforms in the digital space. And this increasingly became interesting to me when I was reading about the young girl, the theory of the young girl by writing collective called Quinn, who talk about the fact that the young girl is not even a gendered subject anymore. It's a kind of state of existence toward which the entire social system is directing itself. So I became very interested in the figure of the young girl, who she was, and her sort of evolution in visual culture, so in painting and photography, kind of affiliation with modern romantic love. So the young girl is often in romantic literature the figure of love, the object of love, and so forth, in books that tend to be written by male authors. So this is where the work began, and I'm going to read a paper, so I hope it's not too soporific and you might not.
No, that is perfectly fine.
I'll try to read it clearly, and I mean, if you have any questions, do jot it down or ask me afterwards. So I also haven't really come to a concluding point yet, just because I'm in the research, so I apologise for that. Anyway, this talk will address the contemporary global trade routes that have latterly been consolidated or reformed by streams of digital data that I'm going to claim give rise to a living currency. And we can talk about whether, living trade routes have always been characterized by living currency of one kind or another. So where once waterways provided physical passage for cargo on oceans or canalways, today we confront a state of generalized liquidity that characterizes financial behavior, currency, bodies and territory. And I think this is characteristic of the digital age, in a sense. Bodies and borders are made permeable by data flows so that they become temporary zones of dematerialization and exception that governments struggle to control. And we can think about the kind of issues with immigration in Europe and in particular at the moment as examples of these. Thus, while tracts of literature address the capacity of data to make seen and make overly visible the non-visible, this paper is really thinking through the notion of data and its capacity to make non-visible and particularly to obfuscate or to make opaque material conditions that it's also enacting. So data has this kind of propensity to expose things, and I think we often think about it in that way, but it also has a capacity to hide things. The liquidity and dematerialization that data can perform is nowhere more evident than in the online currency of young girls, whether as legitimized professional girlfriends, and I want to talk about professional girlfriends a little bit more, such as sugar babies, or in illegal human trafficking rings that traffic young women and underage girls into prostitution. Well, some may argue that these issues are entirely separate. So, of course, there are people who would see the kind of liberal notion of being a professional girlfriend as very different from being a prostitute. I think that we can link those things. So I'm going to sort of move towards that. So they may be bound, these situations may be bound in complex ways that actually naturalise the continued exploitation of women and girls, and particularly underage girls. Both situations evince the latest permutation of women's reliance on the male wage, whereby young women are either consensual in or are forced to offer their emotional or sexual services as a means of subsistence. Thus, while the services of the professional girlfriend are legitimate and kind of accepted, even considered a lifestyle choice by some, there is a way in which these choices naturalise more aggressive forms of exploitation, such as prostitution. So I want to argue that the kind of innocuous acceptability and liberal ideas about the professional girlfriend is actually a way of legitimising a much more violent and virulent traffic in, for example, underage girls for sexual and prostitutional reasons. Okay, so I also want to talk a little bit about this idea of living currency. So in 1970, Pierre Klosowski proposed a theory of living currency in which he imagined a regression from industrial production, whereby, and this is a quote, producers are able to demand objects of sensation for consumers as a form of payment. These consumers would become collectors of persons who are apparently designed for pleasure, emotion, and sensation. How could the human person fulfill the function of a currency? How could producers get paid in women rather than paying for women? Humans are seen by Klosowski to have progressed from earth to instruments to objects and eventually to the signs of objects. The value of reproduction over emotion was considered to lead eventually to disappearance of an idea of a unified individual subject who is replaced by a conglomerate of needs, or bundle of needs that are in danger of becoming hypertrophied. Klosowski seems to articulate the development of human slavery, which has long reduced select humans to physical tools, supporting the material development of the work of the ruling classes. For example, the Romans traded in female captives who were simply used for the reproduction of the slave class, and those who could not conceive were considered defective and could be returned to the seller for a refund. Humans here are indeed tools, but no less a living currency. A slave woman's capacity to reproduce workers, as well as male and class privilege with her body, is the sum total of her worth. Klosowski's later point that producers demand objects of sensation as a form of payment, while consumers become collectors of pleasure, emotion, and sensation, finds unparalleled fulfillment in today's digital platforms. I suggest that digital platforms facilitate the continued abstraction of human emotional and affective life, whereby life itself, emotion and bodies are reduced to signs of objects. So they're not even objects, they're signs of objects. They are dematerialized in that respect and fragmented from a kind of total human subject to create more and more novel forms of living currency. So I suppose in the same way that data is considered to break things down and reassemble and be constituted of these fragmentary parts, so we see the kind of the human body dismantled in a similar way. Anyway, we'll come back to that. First, I want to give some historical background regarding the subjugation of women and demonstrating how their economic reality has always been closely bound with their corporeality, with their bodies, as outlined by Silvia Federici in her classic text, Caliban and the Witch. Federici sets out the disenfranchisement of women from their bodies, knowledge and subsistence by the privatization of land and witch hunts of Europe and the New World during the 16th and 17th century. The era of early capitalism was predicated by a war against women whose degradation was key to patriarchal systems such as capitalism. And this is both in Europe and in America, in the New World. At the end of the 15th century, common land was seized from those who relied on it for subsistence as a part of the kind of capitalist clearance, in a sense. And land was privatized and enclosed so that people, the common man or woman could no longer exist on it or from it. Federici notes that women and peasants lost not only their livelihood, but the common land that was central to their social life. Many women were forced into prostitution as a result of this land privatization. So without any other means of earning money or getting food, women were forced into prostitution. And what happened was, as prostitution became a form of subsistence and a way of life, it also became criminalized. In the mid-16th century, records show that women found to be prostitutes were publicly flogged, beaten, or subject to the ducking stool until they almost drowned, even though male waged workers could buy the services of the prostitute who might carry out the same services that wives were expected to carry out. In 16th century France, raping of prostitutes ceased to be a crime, while in Madrid, prostitutes were likely to have their hair and eyebrows shaved, 100 lashes before being banned from the city for 6 years. In other words, prostitution became the site of a double spectacle that was simultaneously the spectacle of men's desire, but also of women's shame. And I think that that's something which has remained the case throughout the centuries. So in light of privatisation of, sorry, we are going to get to the digital, it's a very circuitous.
This is perfect. No, it's fine. The context is important.
I'm interested in the materiality of this condition. This helps us to kind of understand why we have the sort of prejudices and so forth that we do have today. So bear with me. So in light of the privatisation of land, women in Western Europe were seen to become a substitute for the land, lost in the enclosures. They became men's most basic means of reproduction and a communal good that anybody could appropriate and use at will. As a result of becoming a resource that replaced expropriated land, women's labour was defined as non-works. So also, I think it's really important that at this period in Europe, women's labour is really devalued, as are their bodies. And they're seen more as a natural resource. And this also happened in Americas, in the New World, where indigenous people were treated in the same way. Okay. So, yeah, okay. So during the 16th and 17th centuries, women lost ground in all areas of social life, experiencing what Federici calls a legal infantilization. Women were conceptualized as excessively emotional and lusty, unable to govern themselves, requiring male control. The demonization of women and the Native Americans further justified their use as resources, as well as helping to facilitate colonial capitalism. Okay, in the 19th century, a big leap now, but this book by Federici is actually massive, and it's a fantastic history of how women kind of lost rights over their bodies. It's really, really, I mean, it's an amazing survey. In the 19th century, the mechanization of industry further transformed women's bodies into machines for producing new workers. The industrial age cemented women's disenfranchisement from legal, economic and social life. So today I want to suggest that we're no further away from the sorts of violence that characterised colonial capital and its seizure of lands and bodies, but we see it configured in a very different way. Contemporary slavery, I think, has become synonymous today with illegal immigration and persons who are not entitled to legal protection because they are deemed to be outside of sovereignty and in zones of exclusion that exempt us from considering their basic human rights or protection. The logic of these states of exception arguably make the fact of something like child prostitution seem equally a matter of either poverty or a dissolution of family values that would otherwise protect children from becoming involved in their own exploitation. Thus, in 2011, the US Trafficking in Persons report claimed that US citizen child victims of sex trafficking are often runaways, troubled and homeless youth, or those who have no idea, the article says, of how to be in a normal functioning relationship. I want to dispute this sense of inevitability and logic by looking at some of the wider structural causal factors at play in these situations and the way that digital devices facilitate these kinds of forms of modern slavery. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the sugar trade and sugar babies. I'm sure this is a phenomenon that some of you might have heard about, but yes. The sugar babies are young girls, young women who get together with sugar daddies online and become professional girlfriends. So it's a form of it's what's called a sort of girlfriend experience, the GFE. And this kind of relationship is a sort of romantic relationship. It's like a kind of romantic love relationship, but obviously it's based upon financial transactions, extensive gifts, luxury holidays, and so forth and so on. Also, sites like seekingarrangement.com, which I know is used by a lot of students in the UK to fund their studies. So it's quite a sort of, I suppose, legitimate, normalised form of employment for some people. And I want to think a little bit about this. Even the term, so the trade in sugar babies, is a hybrid of online dating and escort agencies, an online platform that allows, or online platforms that allow rich sugar daddies to couple with young, attractive women that are known as sugar babies. In Heart in a Heartless World, Maya Andrea Gonzalez and Cassandra Troyan discuss the sugar baby as a manifestation of the professional girlfriend, or the GFE, the girlfriend experience, whose services give rise to a new sugar economy, not of plantations and colonies, but of emotional, sexual and affect-based forms of labour sanctioned by consensuality. So, of course, some people argue that, if women consent to these things, then there's not a problem, or I suppose there's a very kind of normalised liberal response by a lot of people to these sites. The sugar baby economy has evident parallels with the sugar economy of the colonial era, whereby sugar plantations were synonymous with slavery, and in particular at that time, African slavery. Indeed, the 17th to 19th century saw this situation reach its high point in the Caribbean colonies of France and Britain, and of course, the colonial legacy made and continues to make the West wealthy at the expense of indigenous communities and those who are sold into slavery. In the sugar baby economy, rather than indentured servitude and violent oppression, voluntary servitude increasingly defines the liberal market economy, and cheerfully ironic market-savvy attitudes to paternalist values. It's notable that the labour of the professional girlfriend must be suppressed in order that she appears engaged in an authentic relationship with her paying client. Cassandra and Troyan suggest that similarly the sugar daddy's desire is to be known rather than to be a client, yet this desire is merely to have the potency of his own privileged class, gender and race affirmed, they say, by the mirror of a seemingly biological and orgasmic response. The idea of romantic love is thus translated into waged labour. The performance of the girlfriend must appear, though, as if it is, quote, uncommodifiable, authentic and extra-economic. They claim that true love has been privatised under neoliberalism. In this respect, we see that where women's bodies were appropriated in the event of land privatisation, becoming a resource and the object of reproduction that eventually used romantic love as its super-economic objective. So modern romantic love, we could argue, has always masked a kind of economy, if we were being very cynical about it. I mean, I don't want to be too cynical about it necessarily, because...
oh, go ahead.
Well, I could be, but I think, love... I think to simply denigrate love as only having only an economic value, or having been only used as a kind of manipulative technique over our lives, is also quite a harmful one. There has to be some, there has to be something left for the subject, I think, I would argue. There has to be some claim to something that can't be economised. Otherwise, what's the point in anything? It's just a very bleak picture. So we can think, and I could talk a lot, for a long time about love and the economy of love, but maybe that's for another day. Anyway, so, okay. Where were we? So, so this idea that love has been broken down, again, a bit like the subject, earlier I was talking about this idea of the person being broken down into its component parts, and each of them can be capitalized in a different way. Each has a kind of different way in which it can be economically productive. So we lose this idea of the human subject as a totality, and also something like love as a holistic totality. Instead, it becomes a series of affects and emotions and states, each of which can provide its own kind of economic returns, if you like. And again, I think that's something which has happened in the kind of context of digital platforms. So now discrete acts that once constituted the totality of love have been broken down into discrete parts that can be reassembled at the potentially, or not, at the ends of fibre optic cables in bodies and bundles that were once wastefully conceived as simple reproduction machines. So even the idea of women's bodies in the 19th century just reproducing the workers or reproducing slaves to keep your kind of your society super productive, I think is too simplistic for what's happened to the productivity of women's bodies today. They increasingly have multiple uses, as it were. Each of these tissues, organs, communications, kisses has been privatized. The authors suggest that in comparison with the sugar daddy's assets of status and property, the girlfriend's skin is the only thing that she owns. However, I think it seems unlikely that anything that can be isolated as such belongs to her. Her assets are her youth, the physiological renewals of tissue and blood that are rendered flows of data currency or living currency. The sugar baby is defined by her indebtedness to her sugar daddy, while his own behaviour is sanctioned by a sense of his own generosity. Sugar babies are distinct from sex workers and receive payments under their real names, usually via bank transfer or PayPal. And I think this is interesting because in this case, the name of the woman refuses to be shamed. And there's something really interesting about that. But on the other hand, the money isn't deemed as payment for sex, but it's for the services of the girlfriend. So, there's a way in which there's a covert sort of perhaps exchange going on. The writers also highlight the appearance of class, whereby she affects a bourgeois status, because obviously she's a young woman going on a date with generally much older men or very wealthy men, a bit like a kind of prince, a bit like sort of Cinderella. She's transformed for the night into, this kind of bourgeois girlfriend, but then she has to return to her class so that the picture or the story can retain its kind of magic and its kind of reproduction, its repetition. So the writers of the article state that actually the desire is more for authenticity than it is for sex, which I think is really interesting, because the desire is to escape the conditions of the contract, which actually they are bound to. So it's this kind of desire for the authentic romantic love experience, which is denied them. So I was also interested while thinking about this in the idea of datification, of how the fact that everything can be transformed into data or turned into data, so can be legitimately captured. All things can be subject to this kind of capture. So perhaps what's happening is we have this plane of material equivalence now, where everything can be, everything loses like the particularity of its qualities. On the other hand, I think data creates infinite differentiation of the same. So there are these diversifying streams of currency, and constituent parts are re-engineered and reassembled towards novelty. So women's bodies are no longer machines of reproduction, but devices of novelty and endless pleasure. The phenomenon of the sugar daddy is not limited to white Western middle class women, which the writers suggest that it's generally directed toward. And I want to briefly explore the phenomenon of transactional sex, as it's so called in South Africa, via Mark Hunter's paper, The Materiality of Everyday Sex, from 2002. Transactional sex also incorporates this figure of the sugar daddy, while participants or recipients of the sugar daddy's beneficence are conceptualized as girlfriends or boyfriends. And again, it differentiates itself from prostitution. The gift giving often includes things like cell phones, rent, groceries, or cash. And actually, in the sugar baby economy, The gifts include all kinds of things, holidays, luxury, expensive designer items, and so forth and so on. So it's not always just a cash exchange. Indeed, good quality cell phones are also prerequisite in attracting potential women. The economic privilege of men provides a material basis, says the author, for transactional sex. For a town like Mandeni in South Africa, the sugar mills of Mitikulu and Darnell created the first industrial employment for men in the area, while women often found work as maids or weeders in the plantations. This was followed by continuing success of the paper mills in the 20th century and subsequent metal firms that still employ male labourers. So there's still, again, this notion of the privileged male wage earner, and the kind of westernized industrialization of these places has led to a similar kind of inequality in gendered lifestyle. So again, what we see is the women becoming increasingly dependent on the male wage, and so sexual exploitation is one manifestation of that. Okay, so maybe I should go a bit more quickly. So
well, you have around 10 minutes before we open up for Q&A.
Okay, so maybe I'm going to skip past it. Anyway, that's a really interesting point if anybody wants to research into it. I want to talk a bit more about sex trafficking online now. And I'll start by quoting Donna Hughes, a trafficking researcher who claims that the sexual exploitation of women and children is a global human rights crisis that is being escalated by the use of new technologies. According to Mark Latonero, online classifieds and social networking sites are used as conduits for human trafficking. Human trafficking commonly refers to modern-day slavery, wherein victims are forced or otherwise coerced into labour or sex across and within state and international borders. This is a quote from Latonero's paper, pimps, madams and escort agencies recruit new members through their own websites, through MySpace and also through Facebook accounts. Mobile and wireless technologies are instrumental in these traffics and have been adopted more quickly than any communication technology in history. Online technologies give traffickers the unprecedented ability to exploit a greater number of victims and advertise their services across geographic boundaries. Today's global technical systems offer women and children for sale across the internet, which obviously is also across the globe. Particular sites utilised for such purposes include infamously Craigslist and Backpage, which actually this week Backpage was seized by the FBI due to its kind of traffic in I don't know if it's been much in the news over there, but certainly it was in the news here. I think it was on the 6th of April.
It was very strategically not much in the news here.
Yeah, it's quite surprising because, I mean, there'd been a lot of controversy around Backpage and its kind of adult listings in particular, and the kind of covert operations in child trafficking, which various agencies and authorities have been trying to dismantle for a number of years now. So it was interesting that this week it's had a kind of knock-on effect. So Craigslist, which is another sort of advertising space online, has also shut down its adult services. This is interesting. Of course, there are people sex workers who are very against the closing down of these listing sites, but I think, judging by all the kind of covert child pornography and trafficking that was going on in the background, it's probably just as well. I mean, I think the problem is how to stop these things resurfacing somewhere else. I mean, it's just Anyway, okay. So in June 2011, Congressional Research Service reports on domestic child sex trafficking found that the internet facilitated demand for child sex trafficking because it can rapidly connect buyers of commercial sex with trafficking victims while simultaneously distancing the perpetrator from the criminal transaction. So there's this kind of interesting way in which the digital space can lead to a kind of disavowal of what somebody is doing, even though there must be some kind of awareness that there are all kinds of agencies, tracking and trying to bust these rings of traffickers. Patterns in trafficking tend to emerge in the use of online classified sites such as Backpage and Craigslist, while social media sites tend to be used for recruitment of young people. Trafficking is notoriously difficult to detect due to the covert nature of the ads used. Images which have often been altered and their digital signatures changed. So investigations may begin with a picture of what appears to be an underage girl in an online classified advert. And today there are also data mining and automated data tools which can scan millions of photographs, because, there are billions of these photographs out there in search of such images and can match even altered images to original digital signatures. And there was an interesting piece of software made by Microsoft called PhotoDNA, which they actually donated to the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children in 2009, which is supposed to help agencies to find images of indecent images of children. Okay. The challenge Letourneau claims is to detect signs of sex trafficking while filtering out vast amounts of noise from services that do not fall within the definition of severe forms of trafficking. So, how do you find these people who are trafficking very young girls? It's very difficult. The paper goes on to analyse events where there were spikes in sex trafficking, and traffickers reportedly tried to increase profit by transporting child victims to cities for commercial sexual exploitation during major sporting events, such as the US Super Bowl, which is, quote, one of the biggest human trafficking events in the United States. They also mentioned the 2010 Winter Olympic Games in Canada, in which recruiting methods took place in the schoolyard over Facebook, Twitter, and other social networking sites, and also in London in the 2012 Olympics, which is just, really chilling, I think, and reminded me of instances in which classically perfected athletic bodies not only function as a symbol of nationhood, but suppress other more authoritarian agendas. And I was thinking of Leni Riefenstahl's 1938 film Olympia, the German film. I think it was one of the first documentaries of a sporting event. It was of the Olympics in Berlin in the 30s, 2 years before Hitler came to power. And it's seen now, as a in the context of that chilling historical moment. And I've read a few articles about it. Actually, there's a good one in The Guardian, a British broadsheet paper by Alex von Tunzelmann, who claimed that Leni Riefenstahl's Olympia subtly underlined a tenet of all authoritarian regimes, that individuals must be turned into machines, that act as required but do not think. In the case of sex trafficking, the operative dimension of the athletes is transmuted to the wider social sphere, a gigantic machine of exploitation and human rights abuses. During the Super Bowl, data was scraped from 55,000 posts collected from the Los Angeles Backpage site, and key terms were analysed for frequency. So this is just, I suppose, to exemplify the difficulty of even finding, these sites and these trafficking rings. Like, how do you even go about it? Well, you can start by using certain words, certain terms which may have a particular frequency, over the period of these sporting events and so forth. So term frequencies included possible age indicators such as the term girl, young, ethnicities such as Asian, Latina, nationalities such as European, Thai, and transitory indicators such as visiting. Researchers can then calculate the various permutations of these categories and isolate potential cases, potential trafficking rings. One cannot assume that online tools and methods alone can detect sex trafficking cases with certainty. Researchers hypothesize that if traffickers are using covert, deceptive and nuanced language to advertise trafficking victims, this necessitates a human expert to be included as part of the feedback loop. A combination of computer-assisted analysis and data collection with a human expert making informed decisions could increase the likelihood of detecting possible cases of human trafficking online. So what's needed is, not only a set of digital tools, but also human interpreters of the data that's being gathered. And this really reminded me, there's a great book by Daston and Gallison called Objectivity, which is about the kind of development of objectivity in photographic practices, right from the beginning of photography up to latter day photographic processes. And they talk about how in the kind of micro and macro sphere, so for example, if you're looking at photographs of nebula or atomic structure, it's not enough just to have the data. You actually have to have informed interpretants of the data to make sense of it. And I think this insight reminds us of the embodiedness of subjects, even as they are rendered fluid and undetectable by data, and the necessity of seeing and making seen. I mean, I think seeing and being seen have been given a really bad rap over the years. But I think in these kinds of cases, there are certain bodies who are always on the periphery of our vision and always on the sidelines, and we need to see those people. So how to make those people seen? And I thought Sarah Ahmed might talk about making a scene, about seeing these people. Yes, those who are at the periphery of our vision and our technical systems. And I just want to end with a quote by Zygmunt Bauman, who's written a lot about liquidity. He's written books about liquid modernity, liquid love. Somebody wrote a paper about his work talking about liquid surveillance. And this paper was really interesting for some of its insights. Anyway, so for Bauman, the database is not intended to entrap. It is a vehicle of mobility rather than the fetters keeping people in place. It is an instrument of selection, separation, and exclusion. Power, Bauman asserts, is evaporating from the nation state into the electronically facilitated space of flows. Okay, maybe I'll leave it there, because I feel like I've been talking for a long time. Somebody's nodding off in the back there against the door. So if you have any questions or comments,
well,
or if you
first off, thank you very much. There are questions for comments, insights, comments. Okay.
Don't be shy.
Yes, don't be shy.
I'm just here in my room. There's no one
I know it's a very awkward genre. I mean, especially in light of what you were talking about, right? I suddenly started feeling deeply uncomfortable about just these kind of venues where, right? I mean, we're talking about how the fluid really does eradicate the materiality of bodies, and the awkwardness of this particular engagement and genre is innocuous enough, right? But the danger is that it is the very innocuity, the very mundaneness, the very ordinariness of this engagement that has all the potential for our engagement to be transformed, right? To be commandeered even into something marketable, into something that will have commodity value, that will be pleasurable for someone to consume, right? And I think that as you were talking, I started getting increasingly restless about the very medium that we are using to discuss the invisibility and the peripheral nature of female bodies, and quite honestly, the very innocuous nature in which today I think most of us in this room have used phrases like sugar daddy or sugar mama, right? Maybe not so much sugar babies, but it's in our lexicon of everyday usage, and it's specifically because that invisibility has been accepted, right? This is common sense. But that was just an initial response that I had. I have other questions, but I'll let people ask or ponder.
That was similar to what I was going to say, but I mean, you definitely worded it way better. But I just think it's so interesting how something that's been really normalized can lead to those negative effects. Like, I never would have connected the sugar baby, sugar daddy thing to furthering like sex trafficking and having like more access to that through those websites, and just that idea that stems from it. So it's really interesting and definitely a different perspective, because it's not like a positive thing like the sugar baby, sugar daddy situation, but it's so like just whatever, especially where we live in Myrtle Beach. It's kind of, that scene is so expected, so it's interesting to.
So just for context, I'm not sure if you know this, Lee, maybe I just strategically left it out of our conversation, but Myrtle Beach has what is called transient traffic, right? So you were talking about the Winter Olympics, the Super Bowl, the Olympics, and one of the words that was being used to say siphon possible trafficking scenarios, covert or overt, was visiting, right? The transient traffic, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think about 73% is what I last read. 73% of the community, if you will, of Myrtle Beach has a transient component, which means that they either come here seasonally because it is warmer than elsewhere, or they come here because it's a very easy ride away to the ocean. It's also a cheap ride to the ocean, right? But alongside that come all these trafficable, unnamed but very present in the peripheries, venues, right, where you can meet somebody, you can hook up, and it's just innocent fun if you want, or it can turn into something more meaningful if you want, right? I mean, the ways in which it is narrated, it's so, it's very tourist friendly, right? I don't think there is very clear and present signifier of prostitute on the walk, right? But there is enough for you to be able to go to a club and expect some level of recruitment or solicitation or invitation, right? So that's what Olivia, the person who asked you the question, meant, that it connects almost viscerally to the specific geography that we inhabit currently.
Oh, that's so interesting. No, I didn't know that, so I'm glad to know about it. Yeah, I think these things have existed in various ways for many years. I can remember sort of being recruited to go to the school disco. Mm-hmm. My mother's stiletto heels, and all of these kinds of behaviours which are really, in some ways, harmless, good fun, and part of a sort of culture of modern romantic intimacy and so forth, but also are ways of kind of preparing us for certain transactional kinds of modes of existence, and the kind of expectation that you have this kind of form of currency, and you'd best spend it wisely, otherwise something terrible will happen to you. yeah, and also this kind of the way that you sort of internalize a kind of judgment about your behaviour in those situations. You know, I think those things are probably as inescapable now for young people as they were certainly, you know, where I grew up. And I think I think now perhaps the culture has become more virulent and explicit about the kind of sexual availability that's expected almost right from the outset. You know, perhaps it's a little bit more mysterious sort of 40 years ago.
Right. Well, there's one other question we have time for. So, Erin, project your voice.
Of course. I just wanted to comment on your comments about the sugar baby relationships and the sugar trade. I was actually having a discussion with somebody yesterday about this and discussing how easy it is to trade sex for money. Even over the internet, you have webcams. There is money trade built into the Snapchat app. You can send money via iMessage on your iPhone. And we were just discussing, like, where is the line between a relationship to sex work, and we didn't even consider the door being open to sex slavery and the sex trade. And it just bringing in the conversation about the digital, about the breaking down of borders. And we were talking about how accessible it is, but never considered that it could go even further. And we were also just discussing that, like, there are websites where people just post naked pictures of themselves because they want to, and how that's, you know, regaining their sexual freedom and regaining their sexual representation that for a lot of women they feel like has been taken away from them, but how that could also be opening up to other things.
Yes, I think, I mean, it's such a kind of circular form of entrapment. And I always think, you know, or ask, why do women have to constantly be obsessing about how sexy they are, or, you know, that sex is somehow associated with liberation? You know, why don't we spend as much time debating our intellectual, you know, capacity in the community and why that's undervalued? Or I think there's still a kind of, you know, it's almost like we're slightly stuck in this groove of equating ourselves with the value of our sexual potency. And I think that's, you know, until that changes, we're never going to get, you know, beyond a kind of this kind of circular trap.
Yeah. I mean, I know we have to wrap up, but one of the ways in which you explained it earlier, I thought really was profound, right? I mean, the notion of female body currency being a natural resource, right? But that natural resource is also attached to what it can be used for. So I think that stuckness that the female body feels or experiences, that she has to present her body as something which is either moving away from the normative spheres in which she's been interpreted and used, or reinforcing the same thing. That stuckness has to do with the very ways in which it has been constructed as a usable resource, right? I mean, the femaleness has become too attached to its resourcefulness, and that resource, and that the conduit is the body, right? And so even to break away from that narrative, the female body has to keep performing itself in a physical way. I think that's part of the reason the intellect, if you will, is kind of extracted. Emotionality, however, is brought in, right? I mean, so what you had said about the sugar baby having to perform a level of ineffability, right? It's so paradoxical that only then is the experience for sugar daddy authentic if it is ineffable. It shouldn't look like a moneyed transaction. It shouldn't feel like one. It should feel real. But, well, I will take just the last minute to introduce Jen Boyle. She is the co-organizer and collaborator on the symposium.
Yes, I'm sorry I had to miss. I had a committee meeting that I absolutely had to be in attendance to.
Life.
Yeah. But the beauty of this whole, which I'll offer some summation to here, the beauty of this experience is that I will be able to see it because we've recorded this, so I'll be able to go back and see it. And I guess there's some final remarks on this. We will be not only archiving these, but we're going to curate them, and we would love to have any additional materials you would like to present along with this virtual conversation for us to put online.
Okay, maybe my next sugar baby experience.
Let us hope not. Oh, but thank you, Lee. I will email you tomorrow. Thank you so very much for your time and insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So there's like a minute.